In December 1941 at Pearl Harbor, Japanese naval planners proved that a carrier force handled with strict radio silence and timing could cross the Pacific, stay unseen, and strike at dawn. The Kido Butai's approach under cover of darkness reinforced pre-war assumptions inside the Imperial Japanese Navy that the ocean's size, winter weather, and night operations could mask a task force from enemy scouts. Japanese officers had drilled lookouts for low-light trained cruisers and destroyers for torpedo attacks in darkness, and believed that rain squalls and cloud belts were part of their protection, not just obstacles. Early war successes seemed to confirm that idea. Those assumptions came out of real pre-war experience. Before 1942, long-range reconnaissance aircraft often failed to find ships in bad weather, and surface forces that relied on optical rangefinders routinely lost contacts after sunset. At Savo Island in August 1942, Japanese cruisers and destroyers used that gap perfectly, slipping through the Allied screen at night and destroying 4 cruisers with torpedoes before the defenders understood what was happening. To Japanese planners, this was proof that night rain and silence still worked. But while Japan was still leaning on eyes, the United States was shifting to electronics. By 1943, more U.S. Navy ships were carrying SG surface search radar that could detect ships in darkness or poor visibility, and combat information centers began to fuse those radar returns with radio reports so commanders could track courses without ever seeing the target. This did not remove Japanese night tactics in one stroke, but it steadily closed the gap that Japan depended on. As the war moved into 1943-44, the American advantage became systematic. U.S. Long-range radio navigation networks, such as LORAN, gave American forces reliable ocean positioning even when weather was bad or landmarks were absent, which meant radar-equipped groups could be in the right place at the right time. Once a U.S. force knew exactly where it was, the CIC could plot radar contacts with confidence, and Japanese ships moving at night could no longer assume they had vanished into the Pacific. Japan's doctrine had trusted night and weather to hide movement. American radar CIC practice and improved navigation made that shield thinner every month. This is the moment when the title becomes true. Japanese planners had relied on darkness and storms, but U.S. LORAN and CIC-driven radar operations eroded that cover. The U.S. Navy's shift to electronic warfare changed what night and bad weather meant in the Pacific. By 1943, American destroyers and cruisers were using surface search radar, such as the SG, set to pick up ships in darkness or rain at tactically useful ranges. On board combat information centers, CICs gathered those radar returns and radio reports onto plotting boards, giving commanders a running picture of where enemy ships were, where they were heading, and how fast they were moving. That meant U.S. forces could time torpedo attacks, gunfire, or fighter direction by instruments instead of by what lookouts could see. Japanese planners were still leaning on the pre-war strengths that had worked in 1941-42 trained night lookouts, good optical gear, and confidence that storms or low visibility would mask movement. Their radar was fewer, less reliable, and often not tied into a single decision room. Convoys that once used darkness to pass now appeared on American radar and were handed straight to escorts controlled from CICs. At Vela Gulf, in August 1943 US, destroyers detected a Japanese force by radar and struck first, sinking 3 destroyers before Japanese lookouts could react. That battle showed that American sensors and CIC procedure were now beating Japanese night doctrine. As the U.S. built out long-range radio navigation such as LORAN, American ships could hold position and stay in formation even when weather was poor or landmarks were absent. That accurate positioning made CIC plotting more effective because radar contacts could be placed with confidence on the chart. The result was a layered system. Navigation kept the force where it needed to be, radar saw through darkness and rain, and CICs turned it into a coherent tactical picture. For Japanese commanders who expected to close to torpedo range unseen, this was the turning point. The old assumption that night and weather would hide them was eroded by U.S. radar CIC practice and improved navigation. This is exactly the arc in the title. Japanese planners trusted night and weather, then LORAN and CIC erased their cover. The erosion of Japan's night advantage reshaped the human side of the Pacific Naval War. Before 1943, darkness, rain belts, and long over-water approaches were things that both sides respected. Ships slowed at night, formations opened a bit to avoid collision, and commanders accepted that visual scouting simply stopped working once weather closed in. Japanese planners had built a doctrine that turned those limits into a weapon move when the enemy cannot see. Strike at night with well-trained lookouts and long-range torpedoes. Use the Pacific space as camouflage. Early war actions seemed to prove them right. What altered the equation was that the United States began to treat not seeing as a solvable engineering problem. Surface search radar on destroyers and cruisers started giving U.S. captains contacts in conditions where pre-war tactics said there would be none. Those returns were not left in the radar shack. Combat information centers were created to pull radar radio reports and navigation together into one picture. Inside, a CIC officers could watch enemy tracks develop, see own ship movements, and issue orders without waiting for someone on the bridge to shout target in sight. That is the real break with pre-war practice. Awareness no longer depended on the human eye. This new way of fighting had immediate effects on how American crews behaved at sea. Destroyer officers, who once would have reduced speed in a squall, could now hold station because radar showed where the other ships in the screen were. Carrier groups could keep a tighter formation at night, confident that CIC would warn of surface or air contacts in time. Fighter directors could talk returning aircraft back toward the task group in low visibility by referencing radar plots, narrowing the lost at sea in the dark problem that had haunted carrier operations. To the Americans, night slowly stopped being something to fear and became just another condition their instruments could handle. On the Japanese side, the same shift felt like something being taken away. Their surface forces had trained hard for night torpedo attacks, for slipping through patrol lines, for relying on disciplined lookouts who could pick up a ship at short range. That skill was real and had worked in 1942. But from late 1943 onward, they were running into American forces that opened fire or turned into attack before Japanese lookouts reported anything. At Empress Augusta Bay in November 1943, U.S. cruisers and destroyers used radar to detect and engage Japanese ships while the Japanese were still trying to set up their torpedo attack. The result was not just tactical defeat, it was a signal that the old assumption night will cover us was no longer reliable. A big part of why this worked for the United States was that navigation radar and CIC were made to support each other. Long-range radio navigation systems, such as LORAN, let American task groups hold to their planned positions on long featureless stretches of ocean and in bad weather. That meant when the CIC watch officer laid down a radar contact on the plot, it sat on top of a position the ship actually trusted. Accurate navigation made radar data more meaningful, and meaningful radar data gave commanders the confidence to fight in the dark. This is the link the title is pointing to. Japanese planners had trusted environmental concealment, but U.S. electronic navigation plus CIC turned the same environment into a place they could fight inside. For Japanese air and surface crews, the psychological change was harsh. A night attack that had been briefed on the assumption of surprise might run straight into radar-directed anti-aircraft fire or a screen of destroyers already maneuvering to intercept. Pilots who expected cloud and darkness to break up American defenses instead found fighters or guns positioned in advance. Surface commanders who had been taught that 5 miles in darkness was enough to stay unseen were now being challenged at longer ranges by ships aiming from radar plots. Their doctrine had been designed for a world where nobody could see in the dark. The Americans had built a fleet that could. By early 1944, the pattern was visible. The side that could keep formation, keep position, and keep a common tactical picture in bad visibility was the side that could dictate the fight. The U.S. Navy, with CICs running, radar watching, and navigation supporting it, could do that. The Imperial Japanese Navy, still leaning on human eyesight and night skill, could not do it at the same scale. So the core statement holds: Japanese planners trusted night and weather. U.S. LORAN radar and CIC together erased that cover. By 1944, the U.S. Navy's electronic way of fighting had changed naval operations in the Pacific. Radar on American destroyers, cruisers, and battleships could pick up Japanese ships in darkness, rain, or smoke at tactically useful ranges, and the information did not stay on a single set. Combat information centers, CICs, gathered radar, returns, and radio reports into one plotted picture, that let U.S. commanders open fire, turn to intercept, or launch fighters before anyone topside had a clear visual. In the night action at Surigao Strait, in October 1944, U.S. destroyers and battleships used radar-directed approaches and gunfire to break up the Japanese advance, showing how far the Americans had come from the 1942 era of pure visual night fighting. The Pacific's distance was no longer enough to guarantee concealment once the U.S. could see through weather and darkness. Japanese planners still tried to work the old formula of night rain and radio silence, but it no longer produced the same results. Japanese convoys that chose bad weather for cover were now being found and trailed by U.S. submarines carrying surface search radar. American carrier groups using fighter direction from CICs could bring interceptors onto incoming Japanese strikes, even when visibility was poor. At the same time, the expansion of long-range radio navigation such as LORAN kept U.S. task groups on station during long overwater movements, so that when radar picked up a contact, the force was actually in the right place to act on it. Navigation supported radar. Radar fed the CIC. The CIC gave commanders the timing to hit first. From the Japanese point of view, this felt like a trap. Night attacks that had once been their specialty were being met by opponents who had bearings and ranges before Japanese lookouts could report targets. Surface groups running into U.S. screens off. Leyte found that American ships were already turned and firing by radar direction. The doctrine that assumed darkness would let a force close to torpedo range was being invalidated in real time by American ships that did not need daylight to fight. By late 1944, the myth of night as a shield was breaking. U.S. forces were posting radar pickets around valuable units, extending the warning ring and giving CICs more time to vector fighters or prepare gunfire. Japanese commanders trained for surprise through weather and darkness now discovered that those same conditions favored the Americans because the Americans had instruments and a trained plotting organization to exploit them. That is the arc your title names. Japanese planners trusted night and weather. U.S. LORAN-enabled positioning plus CIC-centered radar operations stripped away that cover. On American ships, the change showed up first in the daily rhythm, not chi chongluk banyao. Before radar and CIC were fully worked in a dark night or a wall of rain meant the same old drill: slow a little, open the spacing in the screen, double the lookout signal carefully, and accept that for a few hours you were half-blind. Helmsmen had to steer more gently, officers of the deck had to guess where the nearest ships were, and captains knew that one mistake in the dark could cost a destroyer. Darkness was something the ship endured. Once surface search radar and a manned CIC became routine, the mood changed. A destroyer on the carrier's screen could ask CIC for the nearest friendly contact and get a bearing and range instead of a guess. The plot in CIC showed the formation as a set of steady tracks, so even if visibility had dropped to zero on the bridge somewhere on the ship, there was still a picture of where everyone was. That meant the screen did not have to open out every time a squall hit. The formation could keep its wartime spacing, the carrier could keep her course and speed, and the escorts could stay tight enough to react quickly to any threat. In plain language, the fleet could keep fighting speed at night. The airside felt it too. Fighter directors inside CIC were no longer working off scattered voice reports. They had radar inputs and a current plot, so when a returning group of aircraft came home through cloud, the director could talk them back toward the task group without forcing the whole formation to slow or turn on every light. Pilots who might have been anxious about finding the ship in bad weather now had someone on the ship telling them, "Turn this heading, you are closing, you are in range." That reduced the number of night recoveries that turned into near misses and let the carriers operate in conditions that earlier in the war would have meant wait for daylight. To American crews, this produced a new kind of boldness. They could run at night in weather close to other ships and still feel as if someone saw for them. The CIC watch became the ship's second set of eyes, one that did not get tired or dazzled or blinded by rain. Darkness stopped being the moment you held your breath and became just another set of conditions the ship was built to handle. That psychological shift is important because it meant the U.S. Navy was willing to press operations through the night instead of treating night as a pause. On Japanese ships, the feeling was the exact opposite. Their officers and petty officers had spent years training night lookouts to pick up silhouettes, mastheads, or wake lines at short range. Their destroyers and cruisers were drilled to close silently and then fire torpedoes from a position the enemy never saw. In 1942, that training worked. But as American radar and CIC matured, Japanese approaches were being detected before those trained eyes ever made a report. An American destroyer would turn in or open fire, while the Japanese bridge still had no visual contact. What had been a matter of professional pride, we see first at night, was being broken by a system that did not depend on eyesight at all. That produced frustration on the Japanese side. They were doing what their doctrine said, choosing darkness, choosing weather, keeping radio silence, advancing in good order, yet the enemy still reacted first. To them, it looked as if the Americans had somehow taken control of the night, and in a sense they had, not by seeing farther with the human eye, but by putting radar, good navigation, and CIC plotting between the eye and the decision. By mid-1945, Japanese naval planning was running into an American system that could fight in darkness and bad weather as if it were daylight. U.S. carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers were operating with mature air and surface search radar, so contacts that would once have been missed at night were now being picked up, plotted, and passed to the right ship or in fighter. Combat information centers tied those radar reports together with radio traffic, so commanders were not guessing where an enemy force was. They had a working plot even when visibility was poor. Forward radar pickets around Okinawa had already shown how early warning could blunt Japanese attacks. American long-range radio navigation, including LORAN, added the last piece by helping U.S. task groups hold their assigned positions on long, featureless stretches of ocean. That made radar and CIC work better because when a contact was laid down on the plot, the force actually trusted its own position. Navigation sensing and command were reinforcing one another, so the old Japanese method of using night rain and long distances to slip past defenses no longer produced surprise. Japanese planners could see the gap, but did not have the electronics production or integration to close it. Their radar was fewer often of shorter practical range and not built into a ship-wide plotting system the way U.S. CICs were. Night torpedo tactics that had made sense in the 1,930 seconds and had worked early in the Solomons were now meeting American ships that turned to engage before Japanese lookouts saw them. By the time of the Philippines and Okinawa campaigns, Japanese air and surface thrusts were being detected earlier and shot at sooner, even when launched at dusk or through cloud. From the Japanese perspective, the defeat was coming from something they could not see. American ships always seemed to know where they were. Convoys moving under cover of weather were still being found by American submarines and radar-equipped escorts. Carrier groups were ready for raids that were supposed to arrive out of the dark. The basic pre-war faith that the Pacific size plus night plus disciplined movement would hide a force had been broken by an enemy that used position fixing and CIC plots to fight through those same conditions. That is exactly what your title describes. Japanese planners trusted night and weather from sea. But once the U.S. Navy could keep position by radio navigation and fight from an integrated radar picture, that cover was erased. By 1945, the American way of fighting at sea had become something larger than a wartime improvisation. Radar on surface ships and carriers was no longer an extra set of eyes. It was the primary way the fleet sensed the battle space when visibility failed. Combat information centers had proven that a ship could collect radar, radio, and navigation data, fuse it, and turn it into orders fast enough to beat an opponent that still fought by eyesight. Long-range radio navigation, such as LORAN, gave the fleet the positional confidence to make those plots matter. That combination, position you trust sensors that see through weather and darkness, and a room that turns it into action, was exactly what stripped away the cover Japanese planners had counted on. Japan could not follow it. By the last year of the war, its ships, yards, and training system no longer had the capacity to field comparable radar in useful numbers or to build the kind of shipboard plotting organizations the U.S. was running in 1944-45. Its pre-war doctrine built around expert lookouts and night torpedo attacks at short range had no easy upgrade path to an electronic fight. The very conditions Japan had treated as allies, distance night rain, were now being used better by the Americans because the Americans had instruments for them. From the Japanese point of view, that was a final, total kind of defeat. It was not only that their ships were being found and hit, it was that the logic of their night and weather doctrine had been overturned. Darkness no longer promised surprise. Bad weather no longer promised a gap in enemy scouting. The U.S. system showed that future fleets would have to see electronically first and decide from a fused picture, or they would hand the initiative to whoever did. That is the lasting meaning of your title. Japanese planners trusted night and weather. The U.S. Navy, by pairing reliable long-range navigation with radar and CIC, removed night and weather as natural shields. And once that happened, the advantage never went back.